Hi, hello everyone. I am Professor Vishnupad. I'm the Dean of Ishwari School of Liberal Arts, SRM University. I welcome all of you to this BIC event, Gandhi, the Philosopher. So my job is to moderate the session today. We have three speakers. We have the author, Professor Akeel Bilgrami. We have Rajiv Kadambi, Professor Rajiv Kadambi, and then our last speaker is not here yet. He should be here sometime very soon, Professor Chandan Gowda. So what I'll do is that I'll briefly introduce the three speakers, the author himself and the two discussants, and then ask Professor Bilgrami to take over from there. So Professor Akeel Bilgrami is the Sidney Morgan Besser Chair of Philosophy at Columbia University. He held the Johnsonian Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University earlier, the position. He has also been the Director of Heyman Center for Humanities from 2003 to 2011, as well as Directorship of the South Asian Institute at Columbia from 2013 to 2016. He has a BA in English Literature from Elphinstone College, Bombay University, following which he went off to Oxford to do the famed PPE course on a Rhodes Scholarship. Finally, he finished with a PhD at University of Chicago in the philosophy department. Some of his publications, he has written copiously. Some of his well-known books are the following: Belief and Meaning, Blackwell 1992, that's the earliest book. Self-Knowledge and Resentment, Harvard University Press 2006. Secularism, Identity and Enchantment, one of my more favorite books, Harvard University Press 2014. Culture, Capital and Commons, Permanent Black 2022. Two of his books are going to come out this year, hopefully. One that he's discussing today, it's called Gandhi's Integrity. It's going to come out from Columbia University Press 2025. The other book that I'm eagerly looking forward to is titled What is Muslim? Or What is a Muslim? Princeton University Press. His long-term future work is on the relations between political agency, value, and practical reason. Yeah? I'll just quickly introduce Rajiv Kadambi to you. Rajiv Kadambi is an associate professor at OP Jindal Global University, where he teaches political philosophy and political thought. He's interested in political theory from a comparative philosophical and ethical perspective. Rajiv is currently working on his manuscript on Gandhi's ethical thought, examining Gandhi's reconstruction of Indian traditions as forms of knowledge. He has a PhD in political science from Brown University. Chandan Gowda, our third speaker, is a Ramakrishna Hegde Chair Professor of Decentralization Development at the Institute for Social and Economic Change, Bangalore. Last year, his first book came out. It's called Another India: Events, Memories, People. Again, it's a fabulous book. I would recommend it to everyone here. As a matter of fact, we held a book session at my school in Amaravati last year. His other book, which is to come out, is titled Birmingham in Mysore, no less. The Colonial Origins of India's Developmental State, to be published by Oxford University Press, New York. Later this year, sometime in 2025, I assume. At present, he's co-translating and editing the greatest Kannada short stories ever told, and Daredevil Mustafa, a book of short stories by Kannada writer Purna Chandra Tejaswi. He's the columnist with Deccan Herald. He writes copiously again. Used to write more frequently earlier. I think it's gone down, but you're still writing for Deccan Herald, what I imagine. Okay, so there are a couple of things I wanted to say. I have about 2 more minutes. When someone says, I'm writing something on Gandhi or working on Gandhi and so forth, usually my response, I'm assuming that of many of us, would have been, again, it's like, what more can you say about Gandhi, right, that has not been said and so forth? So about 10 years ago, I used to work in Azim Prem University till the last 2 years now. About 10 years ago, we called Professor Uday Mehta to give a talk. He was working on Gandhi at that point in time. I'd not read his stuff on Gandhi. His writing on Gandhi, really took me into Gandhi. And I've been reading his text, teaching his text and so forth, and including Professor Bilgrami's very well-known essay, which first came out in EPW, if I recall correctly, on Gandhi. Now, I recall, if you were to read Uday Mehta's Gandhi, and they've been interlocutors, from what I understand, for the longest time now, if you were to read Uday Mehta's Gandhi, one of the things that, comes to mind, and I remember asking this question to, Uday himself when he presented the talk, there is a version of radical individualism that inheres, Uday's writing on Gandhi. He was a bit surprised by my comment, didn't necessarily respond to it, with adequacy. In other words, he could not connect necessarily that version of individualism with liberalism and so forth. He did not see Gandhi as a liberal. So for me to call Gandhi a radical individualist was something of a surprise for him. But, I would still insist that there is a way in which there is a radical individualism in Uday's reading of Gandhi. Now, what I saw in Professor Bilgrami's writing, some of us have the draft on us. What we saw is an elaboration of, what I found in Uday's writing. In other words, what Professor Bilgrami manages to do in this text is to, in some ways, lay out what he calls, individualism as self-governance, what he calls a non-individualistic individualism. All right, that's one of the terms that he uses, where he says, if one were to frame it in that manner, one will manage to, in a certain sense, how should I put it? Bring about a coherence in, the ideas around liberty and equality in the contemporary moment. I mean, that's one of the, fascinating chapters of the entire, book. So I would love Professor Bilgrami to comment on it, because I think something very important is in there. Okay, I'll stop here now. So the way it's going to go is that we have 25 to 30 minutes for Professor Bilgrami, followed by Professor Chandan Gowda, who will speak for about 12 minutes, and same with Professor Rajiv Kadambi. So that we finish in about an hour or so, and then we open up the floor to the audience. All right?
So thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for choosing the spending your afternoon participating in this discussion. We're grateful that we have Professor Bilgrami with us. And thank you to Vishnupad and Chandan Gowda. And thanks, as always, to the excellent folks at BIC for coordinating this event. The title of today's session is actually from Professor Bilgrami's short piece in the EPW, which has, since my days in graduate school, along with a few others, shattered this lazy, sentimental moralization through which Gandhi had been hitherto analyzed. The sort of standard accounts of Gandhi have a sort of heady mix of looking at Gandhi as this Christian ascetic who's redeeming the world, and with slogans occasionally borrowed from American political science. Professor Bilgrami stays clear of these familiar tunes and develops a theory of reading Gandhi as someone deep and serious, as a careful and thinker. And to pose in Professor Bilgrami's inimitable way, he asks, how do you theorize Gandhi from the contemporary? Now, I will discuss 4 themes that emerge from Gandhi's integrity. My aim will be to ask how we can move from seeing Gandhi as the philosopher to seeing how Gandhi lived a philosophical life. In this short span of time, perhaps some of my points would be rushed and fragmentary. And also before a sort of analytical master craftsman as Professor Bilgrami is, you should just take my points perhaps as exuberations of a neophyte, if any. First is that Professor Bilgrami frames Gandhi as a radical critique of capitalist modernity and the Enlightenment. The 16th and 17th century see the end of monarchical rule through the Peace of Westphalia. And along with that, you have the advent of new forms of political, religious, economic, and scientific ideas that give rise to a new form of politics and moral life, a rationality that surrounds it. And Gandhi's commitment, as Bilgrami notes, to a sacralization of nature puts him as a force against modernity. Bilgrami situates Gandhi's radicalism within the similar arc as internal critiques in Europe in the 17th century. India, he states, was in the same crossroads as Europe was. Admittedly, Gandhi learnt a lot from his friends in the other West. Though here it's the point that it's not just modern civilization, it was colonialism, cognitive enslavement, and the resulting transformations that also made Gandhi peculiar. Despite in Hind Swaraj, when he notes, interesting, he uses the term modern civilization, Gandhi's theory, I would argue, is also not to be looked at merely as anti-modernist, but someone who dealt with the as someone who dealt with the onslaught of the industrial age, but as someone who was deeply working with reconstructing Indian thought. He was confronting the denial of experience, the formation of colonial consciousness, and how that transformed the way we understand ourselves. So I don't want to say that these processes cannot be analogized, but in the absence of a conceptual framework to look at it, it can run the risk of a broad trans-historical claim more than a conceptual at times. So the question is, can Gandhi be compared to the same radicals, the free-thinking radicals in Europe, for instance? In this connection, so my first question is anti-modernism the appropriate concept from which to appraise Gandhi, in the absence of a theory of the West? When Gandhi speaks, he most often does, as saying, I want to eat for the sake of eating, act for the sake of acting, sort of pointing to returning action to its own ends. So casting Gandhi from the prism of anti-modernism is also placing him within this sphere of an oppositional agency. Number two, the chapters astutely set up Gandhi's critique of liberal political and moral theory. Concepts of freedom and equality as developed in Western political theory were not very central for Gandhi. Liberty and equality were tethered to ideas of sovereignty and law. Bilgrami notes the incompatibility between the two concepts of liberty and equality, and how Gandhi, he notes, resolves this, and to quote him, through the back door, as an ideal, through his ideal of unalienated life. More on that in a moment. He states, we have the notion of unalienatedness that is not at the same time the same as pre-modernity with its absence of liberty and equality. So now this nested conception of unalienated life is actually a revisionist understanding that brings back liberty and equality. So my question is, if everything is transformed, isn't the book at some places trying to resolve a puzzle of Western political theory and liberal theory than develop conditions of unalienated life in India and the non-West? Does it at times assume liberal binaries of power and resistance, that it brings back? One of the most important contributions and the clear-eyed insight in this book is really the comparison of Kant's theory of moral obligations and Gandhi. In Kantian moral action, an individual, when they acts on behalf of the world, thus generating criticism for deviation when the conduct does not match to the standard. Bilgrami frames Gandhi as repudiating this entire tradition and adopts and argues what is a weaker standard by way of which moral value, whether one holds it or not, applies to all persons. In removing criticism from the heart of moral action, Bilgrami terms this as the difference between looking at moral action as cognitive versus experiential or abstract in the way Gandhi did. The first looks at moral action where if you act, you generate a principle from the action, and in the second, truth had a more abstract value, that whether one holds it or not, it applies to all. As in Frankfurter's piece on bullshit, Bilgrami argues that both the truth teller and the liar share something, and that is the respect for the value of truth, unlike the bullshitter. So yet a question in my mind that often surrounds me is the category of the liar vis-a-vis the truth teller. Can we take, for instance, as an aside, if you take many of Gandhi's innumerable acts of force, whether it was killing, advocating the killing of dogs, monkeys, or at times, advocating suicide, they were not done as willful transgressions of the standard. They were actually ironically done in furtherance of it. Unlike the liar who at some time, who's aware that he is willfully and deliberately doing wrong, Gandhi's moral agent did not see it in terms of moral dilemmas or willful wrongdoing. Actually, the bigger point here is that should we instead look at it not in terms of truth, but in terms of knowledge, so that we sever aspects of what is truth, or the telling and the valuing aspect of action, as opposed to when you make it into action. Now, the major argument that arises from the book is one of moral exemplarity. It seeks to bridge what emerges as from the subjective individual experience and tries to make that universal. Bilgrami sees that a moral individual sets an example, and in one of his earlier works, he looks at it in terms of being visible and this larger public uptake of the action. And here is where I feel at times, perhaps, the social aspect of this form of action could be fleshed further. Otherwise, it leaves it as a form of demonstration, rather than how I propose that you look at it in terms of a practitioner community, where the criteria is measurable by the standard of performance within the community. What this way of looking at it does is it goes beyond the binary or the dialectic of the individual and the universal, and it also includes those who have inside knowledge. Third is one of the most incisive accounts of the book is the diagnosis, the problem of alienation that Gandhi shared with Marx. Gandhi and Marx overcome this problem. Marx looks at it, of course, in terms of the worker and the worker's estrangement from the social character of man. Gandhi not only diagnoses but also resolves the problem of alienation through everyday practices, ultimately preserving this unalienated form of society. What concerns Bilgrami here is the transformation of concepts. What Marx notes as fetishization, where capitalism transforms social relations as a relation between things. He observes how, as a result of alienation, the individual, nature, and people turn into things like citizen, natural resources, and economy, and nation, and so on. Something is lost in the separation of domains, and Professor Bilgrami brings this out quite astutely. But we must ask, what is the alienation from? It is here that the book does not at times commit to the domain of Indian intellectual traditions. Then surely Gandhi cannot be just a romantic. So, and if we split alienation from traditions, what we then get is expressions in terms of exile of God, or this universal theological idea of God. Whereas what Gandhi was doing is thinking through adhyatmic traditions and seeing the possibility of learning and reflecting on action. The argument of unalienatedness, I feel, could be more openly acknowledge Indian intellectual traditions, or rather, what is alienation about and from? While there's an example and a very closely worked part of Gandhi on caste, and I agree that Gandhi looks at caste in terms of social pluralism, and it also has a way of negating this the capitalist modernity and the kind of devaluation of the worker in the market, in the capitalist market. Looking at jatis only in terms of guilds can end up looking at it as a technique or a know-how. And further, the point about looking at Gandhi's consolidation of the peasantry can at times take away from the conceptual aspect, and that is that Gandhi looked at jatis as a way of structuring reflection about our social environment. Last, I think Bilgrami rightly reads in his earlier and present work Gandhi's pluralism as unself-conscious. Secularism as an idea emerged in the West to solve its particular religious schisms. And we in the subcontinent had shared no such similar experience, and Bilgrami concedes this in his book. Yet at times when Gandhi is looked at, there is a strain in which Gandhi is seen to refuse to mimic Europe. This can at times, for me, end up into a very narrow conceptualization where Gandhi is seen as a reaction to Europe. And this sometimes is also apparent in the juxtaposition of Gandhi in his time and ours, the chronological nature as opposed to the abstract nature of time. So throughout the work, it should be clarified that Professor Bilgrami reads his reading of Gandhi and separates it from his own theory. So it's moot to ask and contextualize his faith in refashioning secularism. And one of the fundamental axes on which this is the differentiation of secularization and secularism. Now, secularization, as we understand, is a process that emerged in Europe, which saw the retreat from religious beliefs, whereas secularism is more a kind of a legal and doctrinal, an institutional way of relating the state and religion. Now, the book makes the point, or it concedes that secularism can exist independent of secularization. And this, for me, is where the argument is slightly troubling, because separating secularization from secularism, for me, is like treating the political and politics as two distinct categories. Not only is secularism rather a kind of a fallout or part of the framework of secularization, it should be seen and as acknowledged that today that secularism has not led to the evacuation of religion. It has led to the reinvention of religion in a political form, as say, for instance, Marx's early works or, say, Nandi's works have shown. In the end, the priority of the right of free speech over when there is a conflict with religion can affirm at times the problematic and hierarchy of the political and the state that were themselves secularized in the first place. Now, this work is obviously a perspicacious analysis of Gandhi, the first of its kind, actually, that gives us a theoretical language to look at Gandhi outside liberal political and moral thought. It astutely diagnoses the problem of alienation and how that leads to conditions of violence, both cognitive and otherwise. When Gandhi said that he struggled at times to express the deepest thoughts in his mind, hidden from language, he sought to capture the complex nature of ethical action. The book, in the end, raises this fascinating theoretical concern about the philosophical nature of truth, something that I feel repudiates the literal, the moral, and the propositional aspect of truth. Thank you.
Great. Exactly.
Thank you, Vishnu, for the warm words. It's really a privilege. I mean, I'm not saying it in any tokenistic way, to have had the opportunity to read the chapters from the book that's in print, that's in press. It's a really large canvas, and every big subject on which Gandhi had something important to offer by way of thought has been given extended treatment, not by itself, but via an engagement with how it's been misinterpreted often, as a means of clearing the path for a proper understanding of each of these things. And as such, it's an extraordinary contribution. I felt grateful that I read these chapters. The big subjects being caste, religion, science, liberalism, capitalism. Everyone knows that there's a crisis in representative democracies and in liberalism, and that has drawn many people to look at someone like Gandhi, who steadfastly refused to get into that mode of thinking in offering a response to the modern world. But what we've had until now are, for want of a better word, piecemeal sorts of indications of this attitude. Ashish Nandi's powerful book, Intimate Enemy, will talk about his indifference to historicism and historical thinking, and his interest in being a creative traditionalist, if you will, and his interest in modeling another form of masculinity. And there's Bhikkhu Parekh's book on how Gandhi fashioned an attitude towards tradition, all of which will seem, in hindsight, little glimpses of the distinctness of Gandhi. And this, I must say, is like a comprehensive, a system would be a bad word here, but I think it's truly a kind of a large, holistic rendering of this entire span of Gandhi's thinking. And even here we have his differentness standing out, which I found extremely helpful in talking about how Gandhi viewed the body. He says we make a mistake if we just see it as a cantankerous interest in dietary habits, etc. Professor Bilgrami will tell us that it's truly about not allowing biological sciences to have a monopoly over how the body is understood. And this is in keeping with his consistent interest in not allowing scientism to take over, a big crucial distinction that he makes here. Gandhi is fine with science, but not with scientism that will abrogate to itself complete authority in explaining how nature works, and which sets up the ground for an instrumental explorative attitude towards nature, which includes human beings and society. And the extraordinary episode about Gandhi calling the Bihar earthquake, a divine punishment for the sins we do with regards to untouchability, being heavily criticized by most people as subscribing to superstitious thinking, misleading people, etc. Akeel will tell us that it's really to be seen as metaphor, as Gandhi himself insisted it be seen as a metaphor, and a metaphor that could be understood completely on its own as a metaphor by the people who heard it. And we make a mistake in trying to see it literally and then dismissing it as superstition, etc. All of these are parts of a larger concern, as Rajiv also tried to tell us just now, to offer a foundational clarity. And that's what I felt most grateful for. At the bottom, Gandhi is committed to what Professor Bilgrami says, an unalienated life. And this is completely separate from how Marx has introduced us to the topic of alienation. But this is, he illustrates it with a somewhat a physical example with someone driving a car. When you're driving a car, it's just not you, it's also the car that you have in mind, a larger sense of what must be done to be driving properly. So an action that is, that is explicitly aware of happening amidst others, and this is not being taken, as he insists again and again, from a neutral standpoint. This becomes social theory. It's not about judging how others might also act in similar situations, but acting in ways that bespeak a goodness, sometimes without even specifying what that goodness is and leaving its mysteriousness there. So it's an extraordinary. So by doing this, what he does is, in liberalism, liberty and equality are given an unexamined centrality, and everyone knows what the problems are. If you're free to possess properties of disproportionate amounts, and if you're free to evaluate talents differently, another source of accumulation of inequality, and then you want to have equality at all costs without regard to community conditions, then you have set up an explosive situation, and we have a model of communism to manage this impossible crisis, or a model of a welfare state if you want, but something like that seems to suggest itself as the best way to proceed in reconciling the tensions of these values. But what Gandhi does, through Akeel's reading of Gandhi, is to say, let's not talk about liberty and equality first. We'll talk about the value of an unalienated life. Once we're clear about why it's important to be in the world as if one is part of a community, again a word that has been often simplified, but being in part of social relations in a thick sense, where the presumption that if I do it, what if others don't follow suit? Those sorts of tensions don't exist. You're acting as if everyone would act similarly, or let's act as if everyone would act similarly. Again, Rajiv has given you a glimpse of the analytical subcomponents of each of these arguments, and you have to go to the book. Otherwise, we'd have to use PowerPoints here to get a good sense of what the complexity of the argument is. But it's truly a very special way of recovering Gandhian thought, and then saying, now, once you have a commitment to the value of unalienated life, the idea of liberty gets transformed, as does the idea of equality. Liberty then becomes not one of insisting on having one's way however one wants it within the rule of law, as much as you're seeking your individual autonomy within constraint. If not constraint is a bad word, but within an awareness of others are also part of this exercise. And there's a way, it's a very subtle way. It's not codified law as much as a contextually driven awareness, ethical awareness. And equality, he's not, he'll say, of course, equality is an important ideal, and we need to do what one needs to do to achieve it through the state, through the non-state, if you will. But if you think of that as an after acceptance of these other viewpoints, you will be thinking about it differently. a question I had for Akeel in this context is this awareness of others, this ethical awareness of others, how does it approximate to the idea of duty that Gandhi says? Civilizations, true civilizations point to the path of duty, dharma. Has it thinned it down, or has it given it a different sort of a spin? I was just wondering how you considered that relationship. And the other question I had for you in this regard is, he will declare straight away that he's not a Gandhi Bhakt, and there are parts of Gandhi that are quite perverse and quite extremely stated, etc. So he won't endorse the model of asceticism which Gandhi endorsed straightforwardly. So I was wondering if you could share with us some sense of how you went about recovering Gandhian thought. What did you feel like leaving out, and what did you feel like retaining in this? Like asceticism is something that you don't quite endorse. Sorry? Asceticism. So your styles of moving in this Gandhi archive, if you will, and there's an extraordinary tantalizing claim that he makes, that Gandhi's thought and work emerged at a time when there was unself-conscious pluralism in India. Right? And so secularism as an idea couldn't have occurred to him at that time, and leave alone multiculturalism that comes after. And Akeel will give us a glimpse of how secularism emerged in a Europe where nation-state building meant minorities being mistreated, and then you, on religious grounds, Jews, Protestant, Catholics in different contexts. So you needed a state that had to actively take this into cognizance. And then the migration context post-Second World War makes multiculturalism something to think about for the Western states. He says India wasn't confronted with these realities, so Gandhi didn't think about these things, didn't have to think about them. But here is the thing. Akeel says now, given how the damage has happened to the Indian community structure over the last 3-4 decades, he's confident that Gandhi would surely think differently. He would endorse secularism. And let's not push ourselves to imagine what Gandhi would have surely done or not done, because Gandhi was an extraordinarily context-driven mind, and contingency mattered a lot. So the responses are, it can't be preempted from us or imagined. But even so, I wondered if you had some thoughts on what he might still value, even in a changed context. The way he thought of multiculturalism, if you want to use that anachronistic word for that time, that communities should live not as discrete entities, but as a samasa. They come together and a higher identity emerges from that living together. Or the idea that sadbhavana is what must characterize people living together, heart unity, and not just about respecting and tolerating each other, etc. So one other question. No, not at all. One other question. The task of recovery of thought, of Gandhian thought, the way you have done it, has mostly relied on texts, occasionally on incidents. But you do say, Gandhi there's a canny pragmatism about how we went about his politics. So if you looked at that side of things, would it suggest extra conceptual material in your task of reconstructing Gandhi today in helpful ways, in pushing this project in a more layered fashion, if you will? There's one question that I will ask on behalf of someone who's not here. When Akeel's first essay on Gandhi came, Gandhi the Philosopher, in 2003, I remember reading it and being excited about it, and Ramchandra Gandhi was actually in Bangalore as visiting professor of philosophy at the Bangalore University. I told him I'd read it. He said, "What's it about?" And I tried to recount it for him in short ways. And I said, he's arguing that there is no categorical imperative in Gandhian thought. His immediate response was that, well, he's categorically imperative about non-violence. I just thought I'd place this question here on his behalf and see what you have to say. You do say non-violence is undefinable as an idea, but it exists. Two more quick questions. There's a lovely line, he says, out of exasperation, I would imagine, against these irresponsible or careless critics of Gandhi. Be right about what you think is wrong. And, and this effort is in trying to be absolutely careful about when you disagree, know what you're disagreeing with. So for me, that was a lovely way of declaring that this is just not a scholastic exercise, that he does actually care when he says radical possibilities, that does push a certain kind of politics in the present. So, and hope is very much part of this. It is not at all positioning itself as just an academic argument that will find an academic discussion alone. So I was wondering if the kind of faith you place in Gandhian thought today, if you could say a little more about what this exercise meant for you in an existential sense. And my very last comment is, in that article I mentioned, the 2003 article, Gandhi the Philosopher, he narrates a lovely anecdote about his father and he, when he was a child, taking a walk on the beach in Bombay, and they find a wallet with some rupees sticking out, and his father asks him, "What would you do?" He will say, the young Akeel will say, "Let's pick it up." And his father chastises him. Why? He says, "Well, if we don't, someone else will." And his father says, "No, if we don't, no one else will." And that for him was a sign of, at that time, an exemplariness to truthful conduct, that it bespeaks a goodness that persuades people around you. But the same anecdote is repeated in this book to actually, as a slice of the unalienated life. As the father is in a big metro like Bombay, millions of people, but is still imagining being connected to social relations in a fundamental sense. So this shift of frames, although they're all together, bespeaks an arc, an intellectual journey. If you could just tell us a little bit about the 20-year-old, your own engagement with this Gandhian archive and how a certain coherence that we see now was arrived. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chandan and Rajiv, for your conscientious labors over this manuscript. Not sure it deserves that much attention and careful understanding and analysis and questions you've raised. I'm very grateful. So let me begin with a question you raised, Mr. Chairman, on individualism and the whole question of what form individualism took in Gandhi, whether it was a radical individualism or some other kind of individualism. I think it's a very important question, and it's central to understanding Gandhi. And it's sort of extraordinary how I think in political theory and philosophy, we haven't really come to proper grips with this issue after hundreds of years of theorizing and philosophizing about it. And it surfaces, these vexations about individualism certainly surface in just the way you put it. Who were you citing? Was it Uday Mehta? Yes. Uday Mehta, yeah. Here's a way of thinking about it. Gandhi somewhere says, you cannot think of us as you think of wolves and animals. And he had very much in mind his individualism when he said that. What did he mean? What did he mean when he said, you can't think of us as wolves, intending to express a kind of individualism? But here's how I think of it. And it's very interesting to compare what he says and to compare what, say, somebody like Kant says, which I think is in some way motivating Mehta's reading. Here's one way to think of it. Kant raised the question of individual autonomy by asking, we have all sorts of desires and inclinations and urges. If you're a human being, you have human nature, and you have all kinds of desires and inclinations. Morality consists autonomy, which is a very central part. It's one formulation of the categorical imperative, that is individual autonomy. Autonomy consists in being able to ask, should I do what my inclinations urge me to do or lead me to do? Right? So, I may have all sorts of urges. In Gandhi, there's all sorts of sexual urges, all sorts of passions and so on. And he says, moral autonomy, Kant also says this, moral autonomy consists in making us, in the capacity to ask something that wolves can't ask, should I be following my urges? Right? Wolves just follow their urges, etc. Okay. Now, Gandhi adds to this. So the brahmacharya stuff is partly about asking about inclinations. But Gandhi has a much more general way of raising this individualistic question. So it's an individual autonomy. I can ask questions that go against my nature, and that's where moral comes up. Moral autonomy comes up because morals is defined by contrast with our, as it were, passional natures, which is how you are. And Gandhi extends this idea of autonomy by saying, unlike wolves, we can ask, should I be doing what the pack is doing? Right? So my mother used to constantly try and acculturate me into certain ways of values and so on by saying, don't do that, Bilgramis don't do that. This was a constant refrain. She wanted me to be. And at some age, I began to say, should I be doing what the Bilgramis are doing? Right? Which is the social version of, should I be doing what my inclinations urge me to do? Right? So individual autonomy can arise in the way Kant says, asking the question, should I be doing what? And Gandhi extends it to asking, should I be doing what the multitude is doing, what everybody else is doing? And he says, that is part of what makes us different from wolves. Okay, now here's the interesting thing. Hegel attacked Kant, and he said, look, what Kant is doing is to raise the question of individual autonomy against the social. And he says, but you see, social acculturation, wolves have a social acculturation, they are acculturated to be in the pack. We are acculturated to be with the Bilgramis or Hindus or whatever it might be. And yet we can ask, should I be doing what the society, the samaj, the family is doing? And Hegel says, of course you can ask that. Kant is certainly right and profound to be able to raise the individualist question. That's our individualism. I can ask that question. But how do I answer it? And Hegel says, and Gandhi says, there is no way to answer it except via what you've been acculturated into. Right? You can't stand in Mars and answer it. You've got to stand where you are and answer it. So the point is that the relationship between individuals, the reason why you can't be this runaway individualist is that you can ask the question and you're an individualist, but the answer to the question you give can only come from your social acculturation. So what Gandhi is saying is, in being autonomous, you stand in one place and ask the question. But you're still part of the group or the community or whatever, and you can only answer it by looking at something at some other place in the group. So there isn't any transcendental escape from it, so there isn't any conflict. You just you ask it from one place. So the social is capacious enough to allow you the individual capacity to raise the question and provide the space for which to answer it. Right? That's the idea. So there's no radical runaway individualism. That's the same way to think of it. Now, of course, in Western philosophy, this is not Gandhi at all, but in Western philosophy, this gets transcribed or translated into the fact that if you can stand in one place and answer a question in the other place, then you can have contradictions, and that's history. And in Hegel, you have these conflicts arise, and then you resolve the conflict by all that is developed. There's nothing of that kind in Gandhi. But Gandhi is absolutely clear that it is only within your social acculturation that you can answer it. So there isn't any conflict. It's just that you have to see the social space as capacious enough to not see this as a conflict. What he's against is this Archimedean transcendental idea of autonomy, which Kant has. Kant simply, and that's part of the Enlightenment that Gandhi is opposing. Kant has that view, right? Foucault attacks it in a completely different way from Gandhi's. It's not this Hegelian direction and so on. Foucault has a somewhat different idea, but let's not get into Foucault. Okay. So that's a response to. Rajiv raised a range of interesting questions. You began, Rajiv, by talking about the critique of modernity. And I really wanted to stress something which I think it's very important to understand about Gandhi. Because there's a danger that the critique of modernity is treated as a kind of nostalgia for. And I think the reason that it isn't anything of the kind, for that, this is very hard to expound. But for that, you have to understand a certain quality of the critique, which is, why is Gandhi so anxious about it? Right? There's a kind of mild hysteria in Hind Swaraj. There's just no doubt about it. And so you've got to understand that there's a quality of anxiety in Hind Swaraj, which you have to try to get the bottom of. And I believe that if you read different things he says, mostly in dispatches to Navjivan and occasionally in responses to questions, the anxiety is that he sees the attraction of modernity. He understands why people, colonized people, want to be brown-skinned Englishmen or whatever. They want to reap the possibilities of modernity. The elites, basically. The people that Macaulay wanted to generate in India, and he sees the attraction, and that makes him hellishly anxious. So I think you really have to first get the fact that anxiety is that you have to have the empathy before you lack the sympathy. If you don't get the empathy, if you don't see why it is so attractive for so many who are poised to reap the possibilities of it, without any regard for those who are not poised like that, you won't get the anxious feeling. Right? So what he's really keen, you've got to get, and why is he so harsh and immoderate in his thing? Because he's anxious in just this way. He wants to stop a perfectly understandable empathy becoming a desperately unsound sympathy. He doesn't, and I think and if you have that combination of things, you're not nostalgic. You're really concerned about politics, about imperialism, So it isn't nostalgia. It's really part of a political sensibility that's anti-imperialism and doesn't want the mind colonized, right? Not just. So I think that has to be stressed, that quality of anxiety. Now, secularism is a question on which you raised an interesting challenge, and you asked, can you have secularism without secularization? Well, I really worry, and I think it would be a very Gandhian worry, that if you say, no, you can't, you'll end up like Richard Dawkins. Right? And I cannot think of a person in our intellectual culture of the West that I dislike more than Richard Dawkins. And so that's and that's a very Gandhian anxiety. So the question is, Gandhi was totally indifferent to secularism. But he had an analysis of when secularism was needed, given the focus on given that it emerged in Europe. Why did he say Ashish quotes this, right? Why did he say, what's it got to do with us, right? So now Ashish doesn't spell this out, but I think what Ashish must have had in mind, which I'll try and elaborate, is that European nationalism, which is Savarkar's nationalism. Savarkar's nationalism is European nationalism. What you're seeing now, right, this quasi-fascist is Savarkar's idea, but Savarkar was just mimicking Europe, because that is how states were legitimated once they lost their divine right of the monarch who personified the state. So how were nation-building exercises carried out after Westphalia for 200, 300 years? How? How were they carried out? Culminating in Germany in the 1930s. What was that nationalism? That's the history of Europe. And Gandhi points out it was generated by finding an external enemy, hating it, Jews, the Irish, the standard, Protestants in Catholic countries, Catholics in hating the external enemy and saying the nation is ours, not theirs. So he says that's nationalism. It gave rise to very often religious majoritarianism, because the nation is ours, not theirs, of Protestants and Catholic. And he said secularism then came slowly emerged in this post-Westphalian development of nationalism to cure the damage of this nationalism, which led to religious conflicts, because the minority religions reacted to the majoritarianism, and you got religious conflict, and secularism came along to say, let's keep religion out of politics, right? And now Gandhi said, we've never had that nationalism. Our nationalism is anti-imperialism. And the anti-imperialism, the Muslims are involved, and what was the Khilafat movement? It was involving the Muslims. So he said, everybody's involved in our nationalism. What is this? None of these nation-building exercises that after Westphalia present here. So secularism is there to repair a damage. That damage hasn't occurred here because the damage owes to European nationalism. That's not our nationalism. Right? So secularism was speaking to a crisis of Europe. And he says, we've never had that crisis. Now, if that's the argument, my claim in the book is, if that's the argument, then that argument obliges you to be a secularist now. Because we have gone down Europe's path, certainly since since 2014, but it was slowly emerging. Ever since the late 80s for reasons. And I don't believe, I think it's bad history to think that what really started, I believe, in the 80s started in the 1920s, which most people think, well, you had the Mahabite element in the Congress, you had Muslim fundamentalists and so on, so also, in fact, some people say the Khilafat movement is responsible for Muslim fundamental, which is total bakwas. But still, anyway, because it's one of the most progressive movements that ever happened in this country. So that's the point. So now, it's not. What I feel is, if you understand Gandhi's argument, then Gandhi, in order to be consistent were he alive, would have to say, it's relevant today. because we've taken on Europe, right? We've taken on the European paradigm now. But you see, what you raise at the end, which very interestingly about the pragmatism in Gandhi, the pragmatism was forced on Gandhi. It was forced on Gandhi on issues of caste. Ambedkar was skillfully using, admirably skillfully using the concessions the British Crown made to constitutional self-rule ever since the early 20s, late teens and early 20s, right? And Ambedkar began to very skillfully use it over the 20s and 30s. And Gandhi couldn't ignore it. The pragmatism consists in the fact that even though he had totally different ideas of state, it was not the liberal state. He didn't want a parliament. He didn't want constitutions. He was against all that. But he was stuck with it. He was part of a party that was gearing itself to acquire statehood, a statehood that was emerging from constitutional concessions that the British were granting the Indian people, and people like Ambedkar and others were exploiting, knowing that the party is going to acquire statehood. And Gandhi said, and that's why I give the example of Lenin's idea of a Janus phase. He was stuck with both. He had his own deep, visionary, profound ideas of a non-violent state. And yes, non-violence is a categorical imperative because it extends from everything to not killing animals, to not having a state of that kind, to not having liberalism, to not having... And so it is categorical in the sense that it reaches everywhere. And so the way I think of it is that the pragmatism consists in the fact that he's got his profound visionary ideas and he's stuck with this. And what I find sort of irritating about people like Ranajit Guha, I mean, I admire them both very much, but Ranajit Guha and Partha Chatterjee, if you read Partha's chapter in the Derivative Discourse book, he expounds Gandhi's ideas, and then he sees him as complicit in something. But the complicity is just this pragmatism you're talking about. What can the man do, right? He's got people like, he can't ignore Ambedkar, and he could have withdrawn. But unlike what Mehta and all claim to have gotten from me, which I disavow as an influence, which is that he didn't have a politics and so on and so forth. He didn't have a liberal politics. That's all I said. And so he was stuck. The pragmatism was just simply that he was in an ambivalent position, and he was not going to escape and retreat. And he had visionary ideas, and his visionary ideas were that he had a completely different idea of the state. And so instead of saying fairly and sympathetically that Gandhi was in this ambivalent position, he had to be both pragmatist and visionary, Chatterjee and Guha declare that he was complicit with this. And it's just not fair. It's a recent essay I read by Professor Ngule talks about the illocutionary and the perlocutionary. Well, you've got to keep these things separate. What is effected and what is intended is, and if you look at the effects, it's not his doing. It's what he belonged to a party which was going that way, and he was very unhappy about it, but he had to deal with these things. So I think that pragmatism is simply to be understood in terms of ambivalences rather than call him a shrewd politician. What is that? I mean, you have to read the situation in which he is and not use labels like shrewd politician and so on, because that's your doing. It's your cynical. I'm happy to take questions. I mean, these were very various and rich questions, and let me see if there's. About the asceticism, I do want to say one thing. There's a very interesting, about the brahmacharya in particular, there are passages which are worth reading, Gandhi. See, it's got to do with Gandhi's views on patience. Here's how he talks of patience, and I'll bring in the brahmachari later. Gandhi thought violent action was a symptom of a quality he thought should not exist in individuals, it should not exist in collectives and politics, and that is impatience. What did he mean? So he just said, violence is a symptom of our impatience. Right? So he really thought you need movements, you've got to wait for movements to have their effects, and he worked, and you can't just jump the gun in the movement, jump the gun literally, as it were. Okay, now a lot of people wrote to him saying, when things are utterly desperate, how can you insist on nonviolence being the one truth that you think exists in all religions and all duty and so on? How can you insist on it if you're really desperate, And he says something very interesting. He says in response, he says desperation. He says violence is impatience in action. Feeling desperate is impatience internally in the mind, in the heart. Okay, so violence is impatience in action. Challenge from the interlocutor. Well, if it's impatience, how can you blame people for that impatience if they're absolutely desperately suffering, right? Oppressed. And he says this desperate stuff, desperation, is just the same thing inside. When the action is impatient, and he says never in an individual's life is desperation of that kind more present than in sexual urges. You get desperate, he says, in sexual urges. He says you can't really avoid the impatience in action unless you have control all the way from the inner. So it's a very fascinating thing that he's got this whole picture of restraint, constraint, which is completely political in motivation, right? Impatience in action. So I think you have to add that to the other things that I mentioned. Okay, let's just.
A comment that Chandan made towards the end of his set of comments about duties as part of Dharma. I wondered if you could talk about that in the context of recent, if I may say so, very narrowly political attempts to get away from rights and deflect them towards duties.
Let me just quickly, I'll answer. That's a very fundamental and hard question. Let me tell you my view, and then I'll relate it to what I... See, Gandhi was indifferent to rights because Gandhi thought rights had a certain history. And it's very important to understand why this is part of his not wanting to have a derivative mentality, a cognitively enslaved mentality. Think of rights. How did rights emerge? In the West, the first notion that emerged was how shall I put it? Before the Enlightenment, there was a very interesting idea of comportment, of civility. There was an enormous amount of theorization of the notion of civility. Civility was discussed at there's a wonderful book by the great historian Keith Thomas, who wrote The Religion and the Decline of Magic, and wrote a book on how civility was used all through the West, before rights came. And civility was defined as follows. The monarch and his courts are defined by civility, which involves a whole range of things, how you carry yourself, and so on and so forth. And civility was semantically defined. Right? This is just stipulated meaning as the opposite of cruelty. So, cruelty was a property of the behaviors of ordinary people, of the poor, and civility was a property of the behaviors and lifestyles of the courts, and the monarch and his courts, the courtly. And this stipulation of meaning, that civility is contrasted with this, hid from the courts, the monarch and his courts, the cruelty of their own perpetration on ordinary people, because we don't do cruelty. We don't do cruelty, they do cruelty. So we can't be cruel, right? But this is a matter of just meaning. This is how cruelty is defined. It's the property of their behavior, not ours, right? Gandhi thought that's exactly what rights do. I'm just using the civility thing as an analogy. And I think it's absolutely true. What is the United States doing? Going in and invading places saying we want regime change, we want democracies there, we want rights and so on. What is that? Why don't they do it? Why didn't they do it in Chile? Why didn't they have the rights retained in Chile? They overthrew it, right? So, but we don't do cruelty. The United States and the West doesn't do cruelty. Cruelty only exists in Mugabe's Zimbabwe. Cruelty only exists in these tyrannized places in the Middle East and so on. We don't do cruelty. You can't account for Guantanamo. They couldn't torture people on their own soil. They had to torture them in Guantanamo. We don't do cruelty, right? We have rights here, so we can't do it. And Gandhi said, this is the history of rights. The history of rights is, he says this, actually explicitly says, that all these rights, where are the rights? Right? You're hiding your own colonialism. Where are your rights in imperial rule, etc.? So that was his basic rule. Now, that's Gandhi's understanding. That was his motivation for saying we don't want to take over that whole mentality. But now, if you ask me today about rights, I think it's too idealistic not to have rights. It's too idealistic to think today that we can do without rights. People have to be made to do things and made to not do things. People you can't rely on human nature to, I think you have to have constitutions and rights. And I think duties in that sense. And I think secularism is part of that refusal to be overly idealistic. We're stuck with it. And I think think of those great young people and Muslim women and so on in Shaheen Bagh, right? They weren't talking about let's have multiculturalism, let's not have rights, let's have every. It would be mad to demand that. They just said, realistically, strict. We have a constitution. The Constitution has made it absolutely clear. Of course, in their rhetoric and posters and so on, they were everywhere looking at, Kabir and Bhakti and so on and so forth. But what they were arguing for was rights, what's already in the Constitution. They weren't talking about, they weren't being ideal. And it's absolutely clear that when you're in a situation like today, it's too idealistic to think you can do without rights. We simply have to see rights over and above duties because I don't think, as we find human subjects in a population today here, you can manage without making people do things and having them making clear that they can't do certain things. Of course, the courts have to be honest institutions, which they're not, but yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just, both the initial presentations talked about alienation and how Gandhi deals with alienation. I was wondering if you could, if you think that freedom or liberation is also part of Gandhi's thinking. Freedom or liberation is also part of Gandhi's thinking, and how it relates to alienation, and I guess it's also related to what you were speaking about now in terms of duties versus rights.
Yeah, so I think that there is a tendency. First of all, I want to register real appreciation of Chandan's really grasping that my use of that anecdote with my father really has an arc, and I'm redeeming things I say about exemplarity in a much richer idea. I really appreciate your getting that, because I think that's very much part of the development of my thinking. That you see, one of the things that is a great temptation for theorists is to think that all good things are the same good thing, and so you find it in Marx sometimes. So sometimes he talks of alienation as a kind of freedom, as a rich notion of freedom and so on. And I think you can see why he would want to say that. But it may be sensible as political philosophers and theorists to just say they're different good things, different virtues, different political ideals. And my own inclination is to say that they're two different things. You see, the reason for this is, and I think it's a good chance for me to respond to what both Rajiv and Chandan raised. It's very important for me it's very important to understand Gandhi as not being moralistic about what he means by the unalienated life. He's not being a moralist. There's this wonderful quote. He says, nobody in my ashram asks. Remember, for him, ashram is not some escape, some retreat. Ashram is basically the training ground for anti-imperialism, for the satyagrahi. So it's part of politics. You can't read him as some kind of contemplative religious retreat and outpost. Okay, so he says no one in my ashram says, what if I do my job of cleaning around me and others don't? Right, so he's talking about sanitation and so on. He says nobody asks that. He doesn't say it's wrong to ask that. This is a really important point. He doesn't say it's wrong to ask that. He says nobody asks that. So it's not an ideal in the moral sense. It's a cognitive achievement to be unalienated. Why do I say cognitive achievement? Because the question doesn't arise for you. He isn't saying you shouldn't say You shouldn't be anxious. What if I did my bit and others didn't? You know, when you're in a social situation, right, in a group. To be alienated is to say, what if I did it? What if I did my bit and others didn't do it? In my argument in the book, I say that's the most general formulation of alienation. All the profound and deep details that you find about labor and so on and so forth, if you distill the most abstract and general thing you can say, in Marx, if you distill the most abstract and general thing, you'll find what Gandhi had in mind, which is you don't raise this question, which is a deeply individualistic question in the wrong sense. Right? What if I did my bit and others didn't? Right? And he says, to be alienated is to ask that question is to be alienated. And he doesn't say it's wrong to ask that question. He says if you're unalienated, you don't ask that question. It never occurs to you to ask that question. Right? So it's an achievement of the mind. It's not a moral claim. And I think that's a very important thing to understand. Gandhi is an incessant moralist, but on this topic, he doesn't say, don't ask that. He just says, we won't ask that question if we are unalienated. Now, it's a different thing, which is how do we, what in our society makes it possible for us to not ask that question? That's a totally different question, right? I'm just telling you what he thought unalienated was. What makes it possible that we will not ask that? Well, Marx had one answer to it, a classless society. Gandhi didn't have that idea behind it. But that is asking what are the sources or causes, if you like. Don't like the word causes, but what are the sources? Because it makes it sound like some hydraulic scientific explanation. But what are the sources of unalienatedness is a question which I set you as a homework exercise. You should all ask, what do you think a society should be like, or would be like, in which that question never occurs to people? Right? It's a very good question to ask. Marx had a rather extreme and radical answer to it. He says you will always ask that question unless you have a classless society. In fact, the critique of the Gotha program is full of how even after you've transcended capital, you won't be able to get over its mentalities. And so he really thinks unless the full perlocutionary effects of classlessness is established, you won't get unalienatedness. That was certainly not Gandhi's view. But in any case, it seems to me, once you see this in these cognitive terms that I'm describing, the temptation to call it a rich notion of freedom, I think, just dissipates. I don't feel that temptation at all. That you're free when this question doesn't arise. That seems to me to be somebody who's trying to say all these good things are the same good thing. And freedom is the ultimate description of political virtue or political ideals.
There has been a view that's been expressed quite often in the West about Gandhi being a process philosopher, and some of them even referring to him as being Whiteheadian. I ask this because if we take the idea of the West, of a process philosophy into Gandhi, it would take you back to the Buddhist influences on his thought, particularly Nagarjuna's distinction between absolute and relative truth, which Gandhi takes almost entirely. So can we reconstruct Gandhi in a way that doesn't have the West as the reference point? And would it be truer to what he's trying to the way he dealt with society as he came? So even the point you made about we are not concerned with secularism because our nationalism is anti-imperialist. that same local thinking, whether that would, if you take it into a realm of philosophy, whether it would be more appropriate to trace the roots of Gandhian thought to Buddhism and its influence on Hinduism through that, but rather than putting it up against the West.
I think the roots are certainly there in Buddhism. They're there in Jainism. They're there in Gujarati Vaishnavism, which I think is actually, I think you can't understand Gandhi without understanding Gujarati Vaishnavism. It's a very deep part. I think you can make analogies with process philosophy when you look at what he says about nature and about the body and so on. I think the process is probably highly relevant to that aspect. I have a chapter on Gandhian science, and I do think you're right that the Whiteheadian ideas probably have affinities with things he says about nature.
प्रोफेसर बिलग्रामी साहब, मैं गांधी के थोड़ा दूसरे एस्पेक्ट पे आपके ख्यालात जानना चाहूँगा। पहले तो आजकल के जो माहौल है, ख़ासकर फ़िलिस्तीन को लेकर गांधी ने एज ए थिंकर क्या कहा था, इसके बारे में थोड़ा सा आप करें। फ़िलिस्तीन के बारे में, पैलेस्टाइन के बारे में। यस, पैलेस्टाइन। व्हाट अबाउट द थिंग दैट, व्हाट अबाउट द से दैट अबाउट द फ़िलिस्तीन गांधी से। एंड अनदर एस्पेक्ट इज राम राज्य। As he stated many times, he want to become a Ram Raj in India, but simultaneously he has praised the tenure of the second Caliph Hazrat Umar. What is the comparison between the time of the Caliph of Umar and Ram Rajya?
Well, by Ram Rajya he just means God's kingdom. Ram just, for him, means God. He's not talking about anything that you... so you can't assimilate him to current uses, exploitation of Ram and so on. It just means God's kingdom. And yes, and you know, these questions about duty, I think the text in which he most explicitly talks about it is his commentary on the Gita. And I think and the idea of duty as he defines it is that it's not, no action should be done for any gain of any kind, even psychological satisfaction. It should be done for its own sake. So it isn't motivated by any form of gain. And that's part of his critique of capitalism, which is that, as he says, with money, with with notions of an economy and so on, you begin to think of doing things, even work. You work for something, for earning a living. He says, no, work is a way of living. Work is a way of living. It's not for earning a living. It's just a way of living. That's why he says once you start thinking of work as being done for a living, you're going to have economists who study a subject called, he actually says there's no such thing as an economy. Economics is a fraudulent discipline. He says everything. He says, I don't see any reason why I should believe about economists and their laws. He said, I quote it and economics is a fraudulent discipline. It is. I mean, it is. There's no doubt about it. You know, it's the only subject I know in which people who've said false things for 50 years get Nobel Prizes. I mean, if a physicist did it, he'd be a laughingstock. In this subject, they get Nobel Prize. Things that have been disproved for 50 years and they get Nobel Prize. And Gandhi saw through this, you know, from 1909 he'd been saying this for 40 years. Oh, it's just the Palestine thing. Well, you know, he wrote extensively on Palestine. He wrote very critically of the foundation of Israel. He wrote And it's very interesting to think about those things. I haven't in this manuscript at all talked of that particular text of his. And and it's a very interesting issue, you see, because if you look at what happened just now, this uprising, which gave rise to this genocide or quasi-genocide, you see, the best thing I ever read on it was a wonderful article by somebody, I forget her name, the author, absolutely marvelous article in which she compares it to the Warsaw Uprising. And now Gandhi says something which you and I might have a different view of. He says the Jews should have never committed any kind of violence. So I reckon that the inference of that must be that he even thought the Warsaw Uprising was wrong. But you see, here's the thing. The way I would read it is his anti-imperialism is focused completely on Europe and Europe's nationalism, its majoritarianism, and basically, and here I think Ashish is right, that his real, and that's why he was killed partly, his real enemy was Hindu nationalism. Right? And I think that goes back to understanding his anti-imperialisms, anti-European history being mimicked here. And you know, it's if you go to Israel, I did go to Israel before the boycott that I subscribed to. When I was in Israel, I heard academics, so intellectuals, sipping cocktails after my lecture there in Hebrew University, saying Arabs are backward, Palestinians are backward. Academics. These are not, intellectuals. Unself-consciously, openly saying this, sipping cocktails. How is it possible that nobody dares say that about Jews anywhere in the world, about even African Americans anymore, but they say it without any self-consciousness about Arabs and Palestinians in Israel? So you ask the question, and I think this is really giving his remarks a kind of psychoanalytical depth, which would be interesting to do. I think Jews in Israel, especially the Ashkenazi Jews, who were Jews in Israel, finally feel they are European, if they can be racists. They have suffered at the hands of European racism for centuries. Their yearning is to be Europeans. They were despised in Europe for centuries. Their yearning is to be Europeans. Racism is at the heart of European history, majoritarianism. And they finally feel we are Europeans finally, if we can be racist towards them. And I think Gandhi's entire understanding of how you don't go down that path of nationalism is very much in play in his remarks. That's what it would make it a more interesting way of connecting his remarks on Palestine to
We'll have to end here. We've already gone past time. I'm sure Professor Bilgrami will be outside, and those of you who didn't get to ask questions, you can engage him outside. You know, I mean, I've gone through the draft myself, barring a few chapters here and there. It's an absolutely fascinating book, as you know, both the discussants in some ways emphasized. I mean, I was talking to Rajiv earlier before the talk. You know, Kundera starts one of his, Milan Kundera, the Czech, writer, starts one of his books by saying immortality is eternal trial. So one of the things that happens, I mean, so Gandhi, you know, is condemned to that fate, but this would be one of those books that you want to read on Gandhi, you know, to really get something interesting. I mean, it's an opening of a trajectory of thought on, you know, beyond the impasse that, you know, we find ourselves in. Thank you very much for the most riveting talk, Professor Bilgrami.